The wind rattled the tall windows of the palace chamber outside. The winter sky hung low and gray, like a shroud over the capital inside. A fire burned low in the hearth, but it gave no warmth to the coldness in the air. The boy lay still beneath heavy, embroidered blankets, his skin pale as ivory, his lips dry and cracked, his eyes half open as if caught between life and death. Room smelled faintly of rose water and something else bitter, something wrong. At the bedside sat his mother, her posture perfect, her gown shimmering with black silk and gold threads. Her hand rested lightly on his forehead, a gesture of care, but her gaze was unreadable. Court physicians whispered in the shadows, their voices low, their faces tense. They had seen poison before they knew the signs, but none dared to speak the truth in front of the Empress. Boy was no ordinary child. He was the heir to one of the most powerful thrones in Europe, born under omens of greatness and raised with the expectation that one day the empire would bow to him. The chronicles of the court praised his intelligence, his kindness, his quick wit. Was adored by the people who saw in him a promise of a gentler reign than that of his stern father, but in the corridors of power such virtues were as dangerous as weaknesses. And Hand, the one who feared his rise most of all, was the woman who had given him life. Her story began far before the poison touched his lips. She had been married into the imperial family as a political prizer. Beauty and lineage, securing an alliance that stretched across borders. But court life had not been kind to her. She was surrounded by enemies, some in silks, some in armor. She learned quickly that survival here meant knowing when to smile, when to threaten, and when to act without leaving a trace. She had watched rivals disappear. He had heard the screams from the dungeons below. She understood that mercy was not a virtue in a palace built on suspicion and blood. The boy was growing older. He asked questions she could not answer without revealing the shadows that clung to the throne. He began to charm advisors, generals, and even foreign envoys. Whispers reached her ears that certain factions preferred the boy's future rule to her husband's present one, and when her husband's health began to fail, the court's attention shifted subtly, but unmistakably toward the young prince. The Empress felt the ground shifting under her feet too. This was not the rise of her son, it was the erosion of her own power. One winter evening, a private feast was held in the smaller hall of the palace. Boy was there, radiant in red velvet, his laughter ringing across the chamber. The Empress poured his cup herself. It was a gesture of affection, or so it seemed. The court musicians played softly as the boy lifted the goblet to his lips. No one saw the faint tremor in her hand, or perhaps they did, but chose to look away. Hours later, he awoke in the night. The pain struck first in his stomach, then in his chest. Servants found him doubled over, gasping, unable to cry out. The palace healers came quickly. They spoke of fever, of a sudden illness brought by the cold, but the older servants exchanged glances, remembering another prince many years ago who had died just as swiftly and just as mysteriously. The Empress never left his side. She sat through the night, her expression serene too. Those who passed by the open door, it was a picture of a devoted mother watching over her sick child. But to those who knew the politics of the court, it was a tableau of control. Her presence ensured no messenger could carry word of the prince's condition to the wrong ears. Her silence ensured no accusation could form without proof, and proof was something that vanished quickly. In this palace, outside the city gates, the people still believed the heir was merely ill. The church bells rang with prayers for his recovery. Merchants closed their shops early to join candlelit vigils in the square. But inside the palace, the mood was darker. The generals met in private. The ministers whispered in hallways. Every faction knew that the boy's survival or death would decide the future of the empire. It was not the first time an heir had died young. In this dynasty, bloodlines were both sacred and expendable. Records from decades earlier spoke of sudden fevers and unexplained accidents. These stories were buried in archives. The public never saw. Chroniclers wrote of divine will and tragic fate, they did not write of mothers with poisoned cups or fathers who ordered the deaths of their own sons. Yet the truth lingered in the memories of those who served behind the gilded doors. As the days passed, the boy's strength waned. He was lucid at times, speaking softly to those who dared to visit. He asked one of his tutors why the stars seemed dimmer. No, he asked a guard if he might ride his horse again. Come spring, but more often he lay still, his eyes unfocused. The Empress's hand never left his own, and in that unbroken touch was both tenderness and an unshakable grip. The court physician, who had served the family for 30 years, finally found the courage to speak to her. In private, he told her the boy's symptoms were not of illness, but of something else, a rare poison. Slow yet unrelenting, she listened without a change in her expression. When he finished, she told him to rest and take care of his health. Next morning he was gone. The official record said he had been called to serve in a distant province. In truth, his chambers were sealed and never reopened in the absence of witnesses. The truth became a shadow moving through the palace. Some believe the Empress acted to protect her own position, fearing that once her son became ruler, he would cast her aside. Others whispered of deeper reasons, that she believed the boy would be used by her enemies, that removing him was the only way to keep the throne safe for the dynasty. The tragedy was that in her quest to save the crown, she had destroyed its brightest hope. The empire carried on as it always had. Feasts were held and the great hall tournaments were arranged to distract the people from the loss. Official proclamations spoke of grief and divine will, but in the quiet corridors where the servants walked, the story was told differently. They spoke of a mother who loved her son so much she could not bear to lose her power. They spoke of a prince who trusted her until his final breath. Asterisk. The boy's final hours came on a night when the palace was unnaturally quiet. The wind outside had died, and the snow fell so softly it seemed to mute the world. A single candle burned beside his bed, casting tall, wavering shadows across the chamber walls. His breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of his chest slower than the day. Last, the Empress sat close, her gloved hand wrapped around his thin fingers, her gaze fixed on him as though she could will him to stay. Alive, a small vial lay hidden in the folds of her gown, the last traces of its dark contents already inside him. Chamber door opened quietly, and a man stepped in his boots. Soundless on the thick carpets, it was the Imperial Chancellor, an old ally of the Empress's. Eyes swept the scene, the still form of the prince, the cold composure of his mother. Without speaking, he nodded once and left, closing the door behind him. The message was clear. There would be no investigation, no questions, no records. Dawn, the boy was gone. The official announcement came hours later, written in language polished to perfection. The heir had passed from a sudden illness. The empire mourned, church bells tolled, and black banners hung from the highest towers. Yet in the inner circles there was no surprise, only quiet calculation, as ministers and generals began to shift their loyalties toward the next in line. The Empress withdrew from public view for several weeks. She claimed to be in deep mourning. When she returned, her presence was even more commanding than before. Her gowns darker, her crown heavier, her voice calm but edged with steel. She presided over councils, as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. The absence of the boy was a silent void. No one dared mention in her presence. Still, the whispers would not die. Some servants swore they saw the boy's ghost in the gallery where he used to practice his fencing. Others claimed the Queen's own confessor had refused her absolution. The archives tell us nothing of this. A private letter written by a foreign ambassador survives it, describes her as a woman who had traded the love of her son for the security of her throne, and who would never be forgiven for it by history or by heaven. Historians who dig deeper into the records find small cracks in the official story orders for rare herbs and powders shipped to the Fae palace weeks before the boy's illness. Witness accounts of the Empress visiting the alchemist's quarters at night. One guard's testimony recorded years later. claimed he saw her pour something into the prince's drink during the winter feast. These accounts were hidden in private journals and locked away until centuries later when they came to light. The image of the grieving mother was forever stained. The boy's funeral was a grand display of imperial power. The cathedral was filled with gold light streaming through stained glass. Chanting monks filled the air with solemn hymns as the casket draped in royal banners was carried through the city crowds. Wet openly, some threw flowers, others turned their faces away, unable to bear the sight. The Empress followed on foot, her veil covering her face, her steps slow and deliberate. It was the performance of mourning, and she played it flawlessly. But deep within the palace, another ritual was taking place in the torchlit chambers of Heir, the imperial crypt. The casket was lowered into the family vault. Only a handful of witnesses were allowed inside. One of them was the chancellor, who quietly placed a sealed scroll beside the coffin. No one knows what was written inside. Some believe it was a confession, others think it was an oath binding the witnesses to silence. The scroll has never been found. The death of the heir shifted the balance of the empire. For decades, the factions that had once hoped to guide the young prince to the throne were shattered. The Empress's influence grew until she was the true power behind the crown. She ruled through her husband, whose health continued to decline. Foreign envoys remarked that every decision bore her signature, every treaty her hidden seal. She had succeeded in protecting her position, but the cost was etched into the memory of those who had loved. The boy among the people's stories began to blend truth with legends. Some spoke of a prophecy that a child born under a certain star would bring peace to the realm. Others whispered that the boy had been reborn in a distant land and would one day return to reclaim his crown. These tales were dangerous, and the palace ordered them suppressed, but they lived on in songs sung quietly in taverns and in the dreams of those who still believed in the prince's gentleness. Later, when the Empress herself lay on her deathbed, she is said to have spoken to an empty room. Some claim she called out the boy's name, others say she whispered that she had saved him from a fate worse than nice death. No one could be certain. Her last breath carried secrets the empire would never fully uncover. The hidden archives discovered centuries later revealed that the poisoning of heirs was not unique to her reign. It was part of a grim tradition within certain ruling houses. When an heir threatened the stability of the reigning power, they could be removed quietly, with no war, no rebellion. It was considered cleaner than a public execution and far more deniable. Empress's act was simply the most infamous, and yet there is no denying the complexity of her choice. Was it cold ambition or a twisted form of protection? Did she see in her son the seeds of a ruler too merciful for the brutal world he was born into? Or did she simply fear becoming irrelevant once he wore the crown? Historians still argue. Psychologists who study royal families point out that in such an environment, love and power are rarely separate. In the palace, they become the same thing. To lose one is to lose the other. Years after the boy's death, the palace still carried his absence like a shadow that no light could erase. In the grand halls, where his laughter once echoed, there was only the sound of footsteps and the rustle of silks. Portraits that lined the walls skipped over his place in the dynasty as though he had never existed. Yet, in the servants' quarters, his name was spoken in hushed tones. Stories of his kindness survived there. Stories of how he would share bread with the kitchen boys or stop to speak to the guards at their post. To them, he was not a political pawn. He was simply the boy who might have been king. The Empress ruled for many years after her grip on the empire unshaken, her influence feared even by foreign monarchs. To the world, she was the symbol of stability. Inside the palace, she was the embodiment of control. Every decision passed through her hands. Every alliance weighed against the possibility of betrayal. Some admired her for her strength, others called her a serpent draped in velvet. One winter, a plague swept through the capital. It spared neither noble nor commoner. The Empress herself fell ill, but survived. In her fever, She is said to have spoken strange words, made claims she begged for forgiveness from a child she could not name aloud another, swore she heard her mutter about a crown. Too heavy for a boy to bear such, confessions were dangerous, and those who repeated them were quietly dismissed from service when Empress finally died. Her funeral rivaled that of the greatest rulers in the empire's history. Thousands lined the streets. Her casket was carried beneath banners of black and gold. Cathedral bells rang without pause for an entire day yet, and among the mourners there were some who did not pray for her soul. They prayed instead for the boy whose life she had ended. They prayed that somewhere beyond this world he had found peace. Centuries later, historians began piecing together fragments of the truth letters hidden in private collections, spoke of poisons purchased in secrecy. Diplomatic reports from foreign courts hinted at the scandal without daring to name it. One particularly revealing account came from a court musician who fled the palace years after the boy's death. He described a winter feast where the Empress poured her son's wine herself, and how a boy's smile faded just moments after drinking. It was not proof, but it was enough to reopen the questions history had buried. Story of the poisoned heir has since been retold in books, plays, and films. Each version paints the Empress differently. Some portray her as a cold and ruthless schemer, others as a tragic figure sacrificing her son to protect the realm from unseen enemies. Truth may lie somewhere in between, but in the realm of power, truth is often the first casualty. What makes the tale endure is not simply the act itself, but what it reveals about the human heart in the grip of absolute power. Here was a woman who could have shaped her son into the ruler she wanted him to be. Instead, she chose to remove him from the game entirely. Perhaps she feared he would not survive the brutal politics that awaited him. Perhaps she feared he would survive and cast her aside. Either way, the choice destroyed them both. The empire that emerged in the decades after his death was stronger militarily, but colder in spirit. The people remembered the boy's kindness and compared it to the iron rule that followed rebellions flared in the province's trade, suffered as foreign merchants found the court unpredictable. The dream of a gentler reign died with the prince, and in its place grew an era of suspicion and ruthless order. And so the story remains a reminder that the greatest threats to rulers often come not from distant enemies, but from those closest to them. Reminder that love twisted by power can become indistinguishable from hate. A reminder that in the pursuit of control, even the bonds between mother and child can be broken beyond repair. When we look at the photographs and paintings of rulers past, we see crowns and jewels and triumph, but behind them there are always shadows. Shadows like this one, the boy in the crimson robe who never reached the throne, mother who mourned him publicly, and yet whose hands may have guided his fate. And if we think such things belong only to the past, we deceive ourselves. Power still breeds fear, fear still twists love, and those who hold it still make choices that shape the lives and deaths of others. The only difference now is that the poisons may be harder to see. Thank you for watching and for walking through this story with me. If you wish to hear more truths history tried to bury, join me again, subscribe, and keep your place in the circle of those who seek the shadows behind the crown.